This is Miss Rago, and this is my 8th and hopefully final take in my very first flipped lesson video screencast. This lesson is about the writing process. And the writing process is a 5-step method for creating published writing. I have 4 learning objectives or goals for this lesson. I want you to know the 5 steps in the writing process. I want you to know some important information about each step. I want you to understand that the writing process is not linear and to understand when to use the writing process. So let's talk about the first objective, the 5 steps in the writing process. Here they are. The 5 steps in the writing process are pre-writing, writing, revising, editing, and publishing. We're going to talk about each step in more detail now, starting with the first one, pre-writing. And you can see that pre-writing has the prefix pre, which means before, and pre-writing is done before writing. Here's what you do in the pre-writing step. The pre-writing step is all about gathering ideas and information and using thinking maps and organizers to organize ideas and information. Now, gathering ideas and information can include brainstorming or research in books or on the internet or in periodicals. All of those things can be examples of gathering ideas and information. After you've gathered those ideas and information, or while you're gathering them, you need to use thinking maps and organizers to organize ideas and information. Figure out what order you're going to put them in your writing and which ones are going to go together in paragraphs, or if it's a narrative piece, chapters or sections. So that's the pre-writing step, gathering ideas and information and organizing them. The next step in the writing process is writing. And this step is the one that most students have trouble with. It's where a lot of people get what's called writer's block. This is your first draft. And the way I have found to combat writer's block is written right here in all caps. It says, "Don't think, just write," which is a lot harder than it sounds. What that means, this "don't think, just write it all down," is you take all of the ideas and information from your pre-writing, which you have on a piece of paper, and you have in order just how you want them in your piece, and you get them on the page. You include all of that information that you've already gathered and organized, and you try to get it down in complete sentences and paragraphs whenever possible, and you don't worry about how it sounds. You definitely don't worry about grammar, spelling, punctuation, any of that. And you'll be surprised when you do this, because while you're writing it down, you'll be thinking, "Oh my gosh, this is going to sound terrible." And then when you're done, I have experience with this. I do this when I'm writing, and I'm always shocked at how not terrible it generally sounds. So this is a really important step, and it should be a quick step. Please notice that nowhere here are you worried about grammar, spelling, punctuation. The next step in the writing process is revising. This is not a quick step. This is where you check for organization, you check for transitions and connections between your ideas and your sentences and your paragraphs. You check for strong sentences and sentence variety. You can look at your introduction and your conclusion here and think about how you can make them more effective and have more impact. And this is a great time to ask for and use peer and teacher feedback to make your writing as good as it can be. Revising takes time. This is a picture of my friend Danny, and he's the author of the novel Train, which we'll read in 8th grade. And he revised this 300 or so page novel 14 times. One of those times, towards the beginning of his revision process, he changed the whole novel from the first person to the third person, which is a huge undertaking, which is just an example of how revising is not a quick step. So we've talked about the first 3 steps in the writing process, and now we're on the 4th one, which is editing. Editing is where you check for spelling, punctuation, grammar, capitalization, etc. And all of those nitpicky details finally are checked here. Back to the revising step for a minute. This is the one that we just talked about before editing. Nowhere here does it say to look at spelling, punctuation, grammar, because you don't do it there. You wait until the end, until you're done, or you think you're done with the writing and the revising. Then you look at all of those details. And I have a handout that you'll get in class tomorrow. It's called the Conventions Checklist. And it's a really helpful handout to use when you're editing because it has the basic things for you to look for. Here's a preview. We're not going to focus on this too much because it will be handed out in class. You'll get a copy for your toolkit section of your binder. But this is just a preview of what it looks like, and there's just basic punctuation, capitalization, spelling, and grammar things to make sure that you look for when you're editing. On to the last step of the writing process, publishing. This is where you get to focus on what your writing looks like, add formatting, text features if they're needed. This is where you get to do the fun stuff like add bold subheadings or change the color of your font, if those things will help with the clarity of your writing, if they'll help your reader understand your writing better. You don't necessarily do it to make your writing look pretty. It's really all about being understood. And I have another checklist, the publishing checklist, which I've provided a preview for and which you'll also get in class tomorrow, that can help you with this formatting. Here's the publishing checklist. Again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on it right now because you will get a copy in class for the toolkit section of your binder. But I wanted to just include a preview here. Here's the first page. Here's the second page of the publishing checklist. And back to the first page, it's got 2 sections here, one for if you'll be publishing or sharing your work on Google Drive, another for if you'll be printing out your work, and then just some general typing guidelines. So we will go over this along with the conventions checklist in class. This is just a preview. So we've talked about the 5 steps of the writing process in a little bit of detail, and this is the writing process presented in a different way. Instead of presented in a line, top to bottom, like this, here the writing process is presented in sort of an S shape. And that's because the writing process is not a line. It's not linear like it looks here. This is really not an accurate way to portray the writing process. It's much more like an S, and really you could say it's more like a figure 8 because it's not a linear process. A linear process is one where you do step 1, then step 2, then step 3, then step 4, then step 5 with no flexibility, no going back and forth between the steps. Writing process is totally not like that. You might go from pre-writing to writing to revising, back to pre-writing, then to writing, then revising, then to editing, and then to publishing, and then realize you have to go back to editing, and then back to publishing. For example, let's say that you have gathered lots of information, you've organized it, you've written a first draft, you're on your revising, and you realize that one whole section needs a lot more detail. You have to go back to pre-writing to research that information, those details, and put them into your writing, go back to the writing step, and then go back and finish your revising that you started. Similarly, you might go from revising to editing, and then from editing to publishing, and as you're publishing, you might realize that you forgot a whole page in editing. There's a whole page that you didn't edit. So you've got to go back to the editing step, edit that page, and then you can go back to publishing again, finish publishing the piece. So just an example of how this is not a linear 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 process. You might go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 5. And really, you can go from anywhere in this process back to anywhere else. So that's just a different way to present and think about the writing process. Just a little bit of information about when to use the writing process. You only use the writing process with formal writing, when your writing will be published, when your audience or your readers expects published work. So you're not going to use this all the time. You're not going to use it, for example, on a homework assignment that's assigned on Monday and due on Tuesday, because that's not realistic at all. The writing process takes time. You will know when to use the writing process because I will tell you specifically when to use it, and I will even tell you which step you should be on. And we'll do it together, and we're going to practice it, so you're going to get it and internalize it, and it's going to be like natural for you by the time you leave 8th grade at Dummerston School. So back to the learning objectives. I hope that now you know the 5 steps in the writing process, some important information about each step, understand that the writing process is not linear, and understand a little bit about when to use the writing process. Last but not least, before you finish your notes, please make sure that you summarize them at the bottom in 1 or 2 or 3 sentences, and write at least one question that we can talk about in class tomorrow about this presentation and the writing process. Thank you very much.